Hello, thank you very much for that very nice welcome. It's really nice to be here, although I have to say, I was really looking forward to being in Athens, and it's a bit of a shame to be just here in my bedroom, but what can you do? This is the times we live in. So today I'm going to talk about it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. But I'd like to start really by there we go, sorry, by just knowing a little bit about the audience. Oh, someone says lovely to see you again, so clearly you're a number one. So I'd like you please to put in the chat box for me, if you know me personally, if you've met me before, please put a number one. If you kind of think, oh well, I think I've got a vague idea who you are, maybe I've seen your website or something. If you've got absolutely no idea who I am, please put number three. A few twos. Quite a lot of threes. Okay, a few twos, threes. Okay. So I hope that I'll be able to by the end of this, you'll feel like you know me a little bit better. I've got a website at ELT Training where I make training materials, and that's been a real big part of my life over the last few years, and it's going to become more of a part. So if you do like this, then do go and have a look at that later. So when I was first asked to do this plenary, my first thought was, well, I was really flattered. I was very flattered to be asked. And my second thought then was, well, the topic of the conference is human rights in education and literature and arts. And why then have you asked me? Because it's not necessarily my specialist subject. So I have worked for quite a bit of time. I did work quite a bit of time in TESOL, in a college of further education in the UK. So I was working with TESOL learners, often who are migrants or refugees. So from that point of view, I've got some experience of working with learners who are from, who've had disrupted backgrounds, let's put it that way. But apart from that, actually, that's not been the major focus of my life. So I was thinking, well, what can I say? What can I say that will be interesting and potentially useful for people to take away? And I started to think about, maybe it's not so much for me human rights with capital H and capital R, but more of a lowercase human rights. And thinking about what our human rights issues are on a very personal level within our professional lives. So I'd like to start off with a task. Now, had we been face to face, I was going to ask you to do a little bit of role play, but that's not possible. So I'd like you to just think a little bit about being in this situation, one of these situations. I want you to think about either you're a teacher, you probably are. If you're a teacher, I want you to imagine that a student preparing for an exam has handed in a piece of work and it was pretty poor, pretty substandard, and you're going to be talking to them about that piece of work. Okay? So hold that thought in your head. Imagine in your head, you're that teacher, you've got that student in front of you. Maybe you can imagine that student already. Scenario number two, perhaps you're a teacher trainer and you've just observed a trainee's lesson. I do quite a bit of this. And they just talked at the learners pretty much the whole way through the lesson. This is not an uncommon scenario, of course. It's quite hard to engage learners and things. It's quite a skill, so this is not an uncommon scenario either, I think. I want you to imagine you're that trainer, there's your trainee, what are you going to say to them? A third possibility is perhaps you're a manager and you've been in to observe one of your teachers on a normal sort of observation round observed class, and while you're watching, half of the class were completely unengaged. Actually, they were on their phones under the table, or maybe in the situation now they'd got their videos off and their cameras off, and they didn't look as though they were doing anything, and they weren't answering when they were asked questions. Okay, so just out of interest, if you're going to do if you're imagining number one situation, put number one. If you imagine number two, put number two. And if you imagine number three, put number three. The manager, put number three. Which one are you imagining? Okay, quite a lot of ones, a couple of threes, a couple of managers. As a teacher trainer there. Okay, all right. So whichever situation you've chosen to think about, I want you to think about what would you say and how do you feel? What are your emotions when you're in this situation? Just answer that last question with a single word maybe in the chat box. How do you feel when you're about to give that talk, that difficult talk where you're going to have to concerned, stressed, frustrated? That can be a big one, I think. Yep, definitely. Anybody else has got any? Lonely, that's an interesting one. Awkward, uncomfortable, worried about the student, yes. Awkward. I'm afraid I don't read Greek, so if you could write in English, that'd be really great. Thank you. Incompetent, there's an interesting one. Yeah, and I think we often feel less than able, perhaps. We've got those difficult conversations to have. And remembering that in all these situations, actually, you're the powerful person. You're the person in a position of power, and you know that there are issues surrounding that. And this is where this lowercase human rights, I think, fits in for me. Is how do we deal with those situations in the best way that we can? Now, I've got a particular interest in talk that I suppose started about 10 years ago. I did an MA at Warwick, where I now work. In fact, it was the same MA that I work on now, about 10 years ago. And one of the modules that I did was on spoken interaction. So we did a lot of work on looking at talk and analysing it in some detail. And I think that this can be a very interesting process, because what you say, what you think you say, is probably not the same as what you actually say. We have, there's often a discrepancy here. We can't remember exactly what we said in any situation. We tend to have a sort of a rosy tinted view perhaps of it. And so it's worth really looking at talk. And I want to look today at 3 traps that we can be aware of in our talk when we're in this position of power and giving our opinions, giving our feedback to different people. Okay, empathy, somebody said, that's nice. Okay, so let's look at these 3 traps. Start off with the first one. The first one is whether or not we listen properly. So again, I'm going to keep asking you stuff in the chat, because otherwise I'm feeling a bit lonely here. So please tell me, how well do you think that you listen to people in that sort of situation, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is I don't listen very well and 5 is yeah, I think I'm a really good listener? Where do you see yourself? I've got 3s, 4s, a couple of 5s. Somebody's been very honest and put 1, okay. So about the middle, all right. I think we all know that this is an important skill, but it is actually quite hard, isn't it? So I want you to look at this conversation. This comes from the ELT journal from 20 years ago, but it's a situation that I can imagine very easily. It's a teacher with some students in a class, and the teacher says to the first student, "What does your father do?" And the student says, "Teacher." And the teacher says, "He's a teacher." Good. Bit of IRF there, initiation, response, feedback. We know this very well, very common classroom pattern. Then he turns to the next student and he says, "What does your father do?" And the student says, "My father did." And the teacher says, what do you think the teacher says? Humour me, write in the chat box. What do you think the teacher might say? I think maybe some of you can really... Well, I think, Hania, that's exactly what they should say, but actually what they said was exactly that. Good! And what about your father? To the next student. So clearly, Tanya, yep, you got it exactly right, okay. It's a pretty awful scenario, isn't it? But we can see it. And what's happening here is I'm just listening for, I'm getting an answer. I'm asking a question, I'm getting an answer, I'm moving on to the next one. I've got 20 students in the class, or 30 or 40 or 50. I need to get on. So I'm not really listening to my students in this way. So I think this is a really useful example to hold in our head. It's a pretty awful one. But I think my father is Agape. I love that. My father is dead. Yes, that's probably another thing that's very likely to happen, is that we're not focusing on the actual content of what's being said, but actually just on the language, and yes, not being very human about this. Nice. So this is one problem, is actually listening to our students or trainees or employees or whatever. The other thing is that I think it's very common that we talk too much. That if we're in a position of power, if we're in a position of giving something to people, then we tend to be the people who dominate the talk. So again, humour me. On a scale of 1 to 5, if you think, yeah, I talk too much, I know I'm very bad at this. Or if you think, no, actually, I'm pretty good. I'm very good at eliciting from the person I'm talking to, involving them in the conversation. If you think it's about 50-50, put number 5. If you think, no, I dominate, put number 1. What do you think? Five, 4, more. Okay. A lot of people who feel that they're pretty good at this. Okay. Later on, I'm going to ask you to record yourselves. You can't do it now, obviously, but later on, I think it's very interesting to see how much we think we involve people and how much we don't. I've done quite a bit of research on this because my PhD research is about mentoring. And so I've done an awful lot of recording mentors and mentees conversation when people are trying to help people to prepare for a lesson, or they're giving feedback on lessons, how much they talk. And it's not at all uncommon that this is the kind of ratio that you've got between the mentor talk and the mentee talk. Not at all uncommon. It's actually very unusual that the conversation is 50-50. Yes, someone who tend to talk too much. Is it a teacher characteristic? Okay. Christine says she measured herself with equity max and came out 30%. 30% of you talking, that's very, very low. So, you deserve, I think, probably congratulations for this. But I think, yeah, teacher talking time or talk too much, this definitely happens. I think it's very easy for us in a position of power to feel as if we've got to give something. Now, I think there are reasons for this. One of them is sometimes it's time constraints. We feel as if we've got to give something. We've got a limited amount of time to give that feedback to that student. I've got to tell them what they need to know. Or with that trainee after their lesson, we've only got 15 minutes and I really need to tell them all this stuff. That there are time constraints. I think that's often the case. The other thing that I think is a problem is this, that if we're in a position of power, then we often feel that we need to give advice. So this is done with the best possible motives, I think. So instead of lack of confidence, yes, possibly. But I think often it's given with very good motives. I have all these great ideas for you. I have all these great ideas about how you can improve your practice. And I want to give them to you. I really want to give them to you. And so I'm going to tell you. I'm just going to tell you. Any thoughts about why this might be problematic? Okay, talk more at this time when we use online teaching. Now that's interesting because I think certainly the screen does tend to exacerbate the problem. They might not want to hear. Deprive people of the chance to reflect, definitely. Their own personal frame of reference, yes, absolutely, reduces the student talk. Sometimes people just need to be heard. That's really important, I think. They're usually question our authority. Yeah. So all of, you've come up with all of these great reasons, and I think you're absolutely right. So I think we have to really think carefully about how directive is useful. So I think, I'm not saying that, only listening is important, because I actually don't think that. I think that there is a place where somebody who has greater experience and maybe greater expertise in a way can and should give information. I think that's part of teaching, and I'm not a person who completely denies that. I'm not completely Rogerian in this and sort of think it's all about, they all know what they need to know and they can explore it themselves. I actually don't think that. I think that there is a place for giving information, but I also think we have to be really mindful of the fact that because you just pour it in, it doesn't mean that they've learnt it. We know this in our very basic teaching, that just because you tell somebody something does not mean at all that they know it, and that you're going to have to find out from them, work from where they are so that you can work at their pace, and as other people have said in the chat, work to that person's ability, but also to make sure that they understood what you're talking about. So I think that this is something that's really useful, is thinking about, how directive do we need to be? How much information do we have to give? How much is useful at this point in time for this particular person that I'm giving feedback to? And how much do I need to get back from them? And how much opportunity do I need to give them to reflect? This kind of leads me on to, depends on the learner's maturity. Yes, I think that's also true. And their development point, I think, whoever they are, whether they're students or teachers or, trainee teachers, what their development point is, at what point, what they need. Okay. Mariella, I think definitely that idea of having to know where the person is starting is really important. So I think that, the obvious sort of next stage of this is asking questions. The other trap that we fall into is asking questions. Walsh says here that it's one of the most important strategies used in the classroom to elicit responses, but it's arguably one of the most difficult skills, even for the most experienced teacher. So sometimes I put this picture up here because I think sometimes questions can feel as if you're pulling teeth, and you're trying to get to a particular place, where a particular answer, and you can't get there, and it ends up being a bit of a guess what's on my mind game, which isn't, I don't think, very helpful. Michael and Duncan have got a really nice paper they call questioning or straitjackets, and I think that this is true for this. So they say, although questions invite a response and thus are nominally interactive, the nature of questions and how questions are used, I think that's important, is far more significant in attempting to describe the quality of those interactions. So if we're thinking about those interactions and how that relates to learning, then for me, these are the two important parts of this quote. So we've got that idea, they're notionally interactive. If you ask a question, you're going to get an answer. That's going to reduce your teacher talk or your trainer talk or whatever and make it more interactive. But it does depend a lot on how those questions are used. So again, a thought to you. How much thought, if you're going into this situation of giving feedback, how much thought do you put in beforehand about the kind of questions that you're going to ask? If you put in a lot of thought and maybe even plan those questions, can you put number 5? And if you think, no, I just go in and play it by ear and see what happens as we go along, put number 1. Be honest. Go on. Has to be both, says Vasily. I think that's fair enough. I mean, there is an element of being led by what's the situation is. Context and relationship, okay, I think that's fair enough too. A lot of people hedging in the middle there. I've got some planned. All right, fair enough. So obviously we've got, you know, different kinds of questions. So what do you think this picture is going to illustrate? What kind of questions am I thinking about here? Any thoughts? Open questions, yeah, open questions and closed questions, all right. So we've got closed questions which have short answers. So something like this. Did the learners participate well in the class? The answer is yes or no. Arguably, these kind of closed questions, you know, should and could lead on to, you know, further further information about that question. But I think not necessarily. What do you think needs to be improved in your paper? Absolutely. Okay, so that's open questions tend to elicit longer answers. Something like this. What about your introduction? How did you feel about that? So this elicits a much longer answer from your learners or your teacher trainees or whatever, giving them an idea to reflect and to talk. Absolutely. We've also got these kind of questions, display questions and referential questions. Okay, so display questions, as I'm sure you know, are questions where I already know the answer. So what's the past tense of go? I know that it's went, but I want to know if you know. So display questions. Very, very common in teacherly conversations, of course. And referential questions where I don't know the answer. How did you feel about that task? It's a genuine question. I don't know. In this kind of feedback, now in classes, I think display questions are by far the most common questions. In feedback interactions, it might be a bit different. Any thoughts about which are most common perhaps in those kind of situations I was talking about before, where you're giving feedback to students or to trainee teachers or to teachers in a school? You could just put D or R if you like. Which ones do you think? Display questions or referential questions? Okay, we've got a bit of a mixture here. A lot of people thinking more referential, but it could be, I think it could be both. And somebody says it should be referential, I guess. Well, I think that not necessarily is my feeling, but yeah, there are places for that. Let's move on and have a look. So here's an example conversation. This is from Copland's paper. It's a CELTA feedback session, actually. So the trainer asks, so what were you hoping that your learners would get better at? And the trainee says, just like I was hoping they would sort of be able to work together and plan a role play together. The trainer says, is being able to, sorry to interrupt, is being able to plan a role play an appropriate aim for a language lesson? And the trainee says, no. We've got two questions here. What about the first one? Is that a display question or a referential question? Just put R or D in the box for me. Okay, so that was a referential question. She doesn't actually know. Now, presumably the trainer has seen a lesson plan. They must have had some idea of what that person wanted, but I think there's an element certainly of wanting some genuine information here. But that second question is what kind of question? Yeah, this one's definitely a display question. The trainer, I think, is definitely not really asking a question at all. They're basically saying this isn't an appropriate aim, and the trainee's rather shamefaced reply, no, kind of does close down that conversation. Now, I don't think it's a terrible thing for a trainer to draw somebody's attention to the fact that actually, the role play isn't the aim, isn't the language aim. Because, maybe they hadn't thought about that. They were thinking about the activity, not the language development. And as a trainee, then they're not likely to, or quite likely not to see that difference. And so I think it's fine. I don't think it's necessarily a problem, but I think it's worth thinking about, being aware of what kind of questions you're asking. So please don't go away thinking, I think that one kind of, the display questions are wrong. I think they're not necessarily, but I think it's about choosing an appropriate tool for an appropriate situation. So in terms of display questions, there are some positive things about them. Can you give me some ideas? Can anyone think of any good reasons for asking display questions? On the age level, yeah, definitely, absolutely. But I think really at all levels, display questions can be helpful, because I'm thinking here about how you give people feedback on what they have done already, whether those people are students, or whether they're adults, whether they're trainee teachers, whether they're practicing teachers. It saves time, they elicit information, access previous knowledge, all of those things, absolutely. Okay, quick pace quiz, yeah, absolutely, could that do that sort of thing. So they're quite useful for directing a conversation. I think, we have talked about time constraints. We're usually not in a position where we've got unlimited time for this sort of thing. Can develop student self-esteem if they get it right, yes. Friendly, not intimidating, absolutely great. It's so nice that you're being so participatory here. I'm really enjoying it, thank you. Can be supportive. We had that, so that idea of developing self-esteem when you're eliciting or prompting an answer. If you want to help someone to get to an answer, maybe they haven't quite got it yet, it can be quite supportive, I think, and really useful to check understanding, current knowledge. So I think we really all said these things. Any thoughts about the but? What about the but? What can be problematic? Well, Socratic, love it. No, well, we're in the land of Socrates, or at least you are. I'm not, but I would like to be. So I guess that's as it should be, isn't it? Lose half it. Definitely, I think that's right, Eleni. Lose half wrong. Yes, absolutely. Especially if it's in a group or something, then that can be true. Okay. So it tends to lead to short answers. Display questions are often closed questions, not always, of course, but they tend to be. Therefore, it sort of narrows the answer down. You're definitely pushing people in a particular way if you're asking display questions. You're after information on a certain thing, and that I think sometimes they can be perceived as patronising, especially for adults, and maybe for teenagers too, who have got, I think, quite as often got sensitive radar for this kind of thing. Limits the quality of student reply. Yep, can do. So I think that whilst we, I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater here. There are good reasons to ask display questions sometimes, because they can direct things and save time and allow us not to be, too woolly in a big area, but actually going in the direction that we want to go in. But you have to be a bit careful with them because there can be problems. Let's think about referential questions then. What are the positive things about these? What positive things can you see about referential questions, asking questions where you don't know the answer, more open questions generally? Personal reactions, more reflective, empower participants, yes. So we've got a lot of things about active listening. Yes, they certainly would increase that, I think, from the speaker, from the questioner. Display and then referential as a follow-up, yes, absolutely. Or the other way around, I think both of these things have a place, don't they? Definitely. So you're doing all the work for me here. This is great. More authentic. I think that one perhaps didn't come up, but you've got a more authentic kind of dialogue with somebody potentially, I suppose, and that comes back to the active listening that somebody mentioned and personalised. Usually more open. So again, we've talked about this, about that idea of encouraging reflection, tend to elicit longer answers, can open up the conversation as well. So I think that can be a really good thing, and we're more likely to know where people are from their interests, I suppose, and their particular concerns. What about the problems? Because they're not problem free either, these kind of referential questions. What kind of problems can we have with that? Unexpected outcomes, Julie. Yeah, definitely. Unplannable, absolutely. Skills and maturity, yes. From both parties, I think, from the speaker and from the time. Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important one. Okay, you've got the same points that I have, really. Less focused conversation, little direction, too open and therefore difficult to answer. Sometimes, it's really helpful to have a direction to be taken in. It doesn't a focus, I suppose. You don't necessarily want to be asked, what do you think about your whole lesson? Or what do you think about your whole piece of work? Tell me all of this. You might want to be focusing people a little bit and say, well, let's have a look at, I don't know, your tense work here. What did you think about the tense work? What do you think about the structure of your of your assignment, for example? So I think that, it's quite helpful sometimes to have a direction, because as we've mentioned, we don't ever really have unlimited time. And often we've got quite a, people not feel strong stating their opinion. Yes, I think that's true too. So they can be very supportive, I think. Let's have a look at this as an example, though. I think that this is another sort of different kind of way of questioning where it's not very helpful. So the mentor says, I don't think you need to do the lead-in activity, it's very time consuming. And Ming says, okay, but I think it might be useful if they have time to discuss about their travel experiences before I start the unit. So this is a school mentor with a trainee teacher who's got an idea about something they want to do, and they've got a reason for it. Useful to have this discussion. I think that's a reasonable kind of reason. The mentor then says, not really, their English is not so good, they may just chat in Chinese, I suggest you teach the words first, what do you think? And Ming just caves in and says, okay. Now, I think that this is quite an interesting example, because we've got a situation where the school mentor, I think, is probably, I think she does come across, I say she, because teachers often are, they perhaps come across as, rather brusque perhaps, and rather direct. Their English is not so good, they may chat in Chinese, just teach them the words. What do you think? Authority, somebody says, and yeah, absolutely. I think there's a real feeling of authoritarian stance there, isn't there? She does nominally ask, what do you think? But clearly there's no way in that situation that Ming could say, well, actually, no, I don't agree with you. There's no way that she could, because she's already given her answer. She's already given a reason for it, which is, a reasonable reason. And the school teacher, the mentor, I think, there is trying to help. She's trying to say, well, yes, okay, but it won't work because I know it won't work because I have experience in this situation, and that's not going to happen. These are going to be the problems. But it does rather cut Ming down. So I think that, when we use questioning techniques, we have to be quite careful about making sure that we're genuinely trying to respect people's opinion, bring them on board. Perhaps, asking Ming, rather than saying, given these ideas, we could just say, well, tell me, what could she have said? The second answer from the school mentor, rather than saying, not really, blah, 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 what could she have said? What questions could she have asked? Could she ask, I suppose? In that situation, what would you say? Okay, mentor could ask teacher to consider challenges involved. Yes, I think that's a really, Marusa, thank you. I think that's a really nice idea. Do you think they can do that in English? Yep. Okay. Would you say that's a top priority? Okay. Giving a suggestion, honey, specific question answer in pairs, yeah. Enlisting benefits and possible difficulties, absolutely. So I think that those would be perhaps slightly more respectful ways that would encourage and promote Ming's self-esteem and her reflective capacity as a teacher, rather than just saying, this is how it's going to be, what do you think? Okay, I'll just do it. So yeah, you're all very good. You shouldn't be here at all. You should be just out giving feedback to your whoever's. Okay, so these really leads on to my third point. So we've had talking about listening, the problems of listening and how you can fall into that trap, the problems of asking questions and the traps you can fall into with that. And this is my third point, which is being kind. Somebody said to me once, it's better to be kind than right. And I thought that was really nice. I'm not entirely sure it's always true, but it's something that I try to keep in mind. There is a caveat with this. So I think that you should be kind to people and you should try and be nice to people. But there's a caveat between wrapping things up, feedback. If we're giving feedback to people, if we wrap it all up in cotton wool, or we can tell people very straight and direct with a sledgehammer. And there's a sort of a climb between these two things. You can completely wrap it up in cotton wool, or you can completely give it to them in a very direct way, or you can do something in the middle, and clearly something in the middle is usually preferable, but it depends where on that climb you're going to sit, I think, doesn't it? Because what the person who you're giving feedback will say is that we want to know how we can improve. So you may think, well, actually wrapping it up in lots of cotton wool, making it really kind, making sure I'm asking them questions and getting it all from them, that can be, really nice and friendly and bolster their self-esteem, but maybe it's so kind they don't actually understand what you wanted them to learn. Whereas on the other hand, the sledgehammer, you can be very direct. You're telling them exactly, this is what you should do, like the mentor we've just seen. But it gives a very, very clear message as to what's needed. And so I think that there's a balance between these two things, and we have to be careful not to think, oh, well, just making it kind and nice is the best thing, because it isn't always. I think there's definitely a balance. And this balance has got all sorts of ways in which it's factors which are important. Your relationship with the person, how well you know them, what kind of person you are, what kind of person they are. The day, whether they had a bad day and they come in crying, then clearly you're going to have to be kinder. Start with positive, yes. Okay, soft voice, that's an important one. But I think we do have to think about that idea of if you say something very directly to people, they tend to build a wall. If I say to you, your lesson was really poor, immediately I'm kind of being very upset and defensive and thinking, well, I don't think it was that bad. And so I'm not listening. As a person who's taking on feedback, I'm not going to listen. So I think it is important to make these things, to phrase these things in a way that's acceptable so that people are open to hear what you're saying. So confirmatory talk and praise is important. I think you definitely need to tell people what they're doing right as well as what they're doing not so right. But it's really important that this is authentic, because people very quickly see inauthenticity. Oh, your lesson was so great. And if they came out thinking, well, actually it was awful because the teacher, the students didn't do anything, or I've got my piece of work that I've given to the teacher and I know it's not that great, actually I didn't spend that long on it, and the teacher's being effusively praiseworthy of it, then I know it's not true. So it has to be authentic, and I think praise has to be specific. It means more, and it's more authentic, and it's more genuine, and it's easier to accept if it's specific. This particular thing was very good. You did this particular thing in a really good way. This language that you used these phrases, and they were really great. I can see that you're using this vocabulary that we learnt in class last week. Fantastic for including that, for example. Moving on then to sort of have, the more difficult things when we have to criticise people. Here's another little task for you. Which of these sounds the kindest? You should have given clearer, let's assume it's all in a nice voice. You should have given clearer instructions. You could have given clearer instructions. You could give clear instructions. Which 1, 2 or 3, which one do you think sounds the best? Okay, the vast majority of you think 3. I agree with you, I think 3. So I think that, this is interesting. If we look at this why, I think that 2 is kinder than 3, and I think that 3 is kinder than 2, personally. Okay, so I wonder what it would look like if you gave clearer instructions. Okay, fair enough. So should, have to, these stronger modals tend to again imply authority. And you might not want to do that. So could, I think, implies more of a possibility than an obligation. And I think therefore it sounds kinder. But the difference between the second and the third one for me is a really interesting little linguistic trick. And it's something that somebody told me a very, very long time ago when I first started to be a teacher trainer. So, 20 years ago. And it stuck with me so well because it's such an easy trick and it means the same thing. So you could have given clear instructions and you could give clear instructions. Actually, it means exactly the same thing. The function there is exactly the same. What it means is give clearer instructions. That's what it means. But in one case, it's a backwards facing modal. It's a past modal and it's a criticism because I cannot change the past. Whereas in the second case, it's a suggestion because I can change the future. So, and all I've done here is taken out the have and changed the past participle for an infinitive. So it's a very easy trick to do linguistically, a very easy thing to change, and I think it really does make a difference. Now, maybe it doesn't really, maybe this is just a tiny thing, but I think these tiny things make a difference to the whole. Let's have another one. Which sounds the kindest out of these ones? This is wrong, past tense here. You have to use the past tense here. We use the past tense here. Again, which one do you like best out of these ones? Yeah, again, it's not a difficult question, isn't it? But at least there's a bit of interaction going on here. I did think about mixing these up and making it a little bit more thought-provoking, but I decided just to keep it with this. Okay, so with the first one, obviously, we're using the word wrong. Now, it's not wrong to say wrong sometimes. I think it's okay. Again, it's that clarity of message, isn't it? And we've given, we're given a bit of clear sort of meta language here about past tense. The difference I think for me is interesting is between number 2 and number 3. So you have to use the past tense here. So the first thing is we've got a you. We're posting it here away from me and towards you. And obviously with the have to, we've got the strong obligation here. And it is true, of course, in this particular situation, we have to use the past tense here. But with the second one, what we're actually doing is we're using an inclusive personal pronoun here, we, and we're just phrasing it as a neutral statement. We use the past tense here, including that person in English language users, Or if they were teachers, then including them in it, trainee teachers, for example, including them in a, we're all teachers, you're part of the profession, you're part of the language, users community. So it includes people. And I think that that's, a positive thing. And again, it's a linguistically easy thing to do. It's not very difficult to change a pronoun. Here's another point. We often do things like, the whole idea of sandwich feedback and paired feedback, a complement or an action point. So your slides are very professional, but you're relying on them too much. Which part of that sentence does the trainee hear? The first clause or the second clause? Yeah, but yes, absolutely, Theodore. Yep, okay. So although we've got two different things there, that's actually what they hear, isn't it? It's blah, 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 but you're relying on them too much. Okay, so all I really hear is the but and what comes after it. Again, quite linguistically easy to just separate those two things. Your slides are very professional, and maybe be more specific about it. They're colourful, you've got great images, well done. There's a lot of work there. So actually give due praise where it's due. Then have a look at the second thing. You spent a lot of time at the board looking through your slides. Have you got any thoughts about this? So here we're highlighting the point, we're directing the conversation. I want to talk about the fact that you're relying on these beautiful slides that you've made, but I am allowing that person to tell me why. There might be reasons for it. I just felt really nervous and they supported me. Okay, yeah, that's understandable. Let's think about how you could overcome those nerves. So I think that an important thing is to be aware. We've talked about these three things: listening, asking questions, being kind. And actually what you need to do is to try to be aware of this, because it isn't always easy. Because, when you're answering me, I'm asking you what do you think you do? And actually we're not aware of it. We'd like to think, I'm taking this completely personally. I'd like to think that I'm very inclusive with my feedback. I've done a lot of listening to feedback, my own and other people's. I'd like to think I'm very inclusive and that I ask questions and that I really listen to people. But actually I've listened to my own feedback and I often don't. I'm often quite directive, and I'm often, I've got my own agenda and I want to get to that agenda. It's quite easy to fall into those traps.
Joe, I just wanted to say you have about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, I know. I'm hoping to have about 5 minutes for questions, so I'm nearly there. Thank you. That's great. Thanks for giving me that heads up. So this paper from Ullen Barak and Rakamin was a teacher mentor, so somebody who was mentoring a trainee teacher who recorded her feedback to the mentee and was reflecting on it. And this was quite interesting, I think. She said, watching myself during the feedback, through the conversation, makes me wonder whether I'm controlling the discourse too much. I notice I use a lot of language of telling. And as I watch myself, I can identify similarities between my controlling talk as a mentor and Chen's controlling talk as a teacher. So I think this is very common, isn't it? You're saying you shouldn't be doing this, but actually you're saying it in a way in which you're doing exactly the same thing. I know I do that with my children when they were little. I could hear myself screaming at them, stop shouting at each other! And then I'd sort of, hear myself and think it was a little bit ironic. But this is certainly not what I thought I was doing. So I think that we often don't know what we're doing, really. We have a rosy tinted view of what we're doing. And one of my mentors in a session came up with this. This is what she said after she'd listened to her feedback.
In the first mentoring session, as my mentee was confused, I asked a lot of questions, and when I listened to the recording, I got horrified. For two things. Because if you ask someone so many questions, the questions will make that person confused. I felt that My mentee became more confused because I asked so many questions. She realized that she wasn't in the right track because I was asking so many questions. And again, I never realized before recording both the mentoring sessions that my voice sounds so rough. I mean, the delivery matters as well. To be very honest, I mean, if someone speaks with me and the voice is very rough, should I feel confident? Should I feel, how should I feel? So it seemed to me that I need to speak a bit slow as well as reflect before I speak, like think and speak at the same time, not speaking first and then thinking later on.
Okay.
So that's one of the best things I have discovered from it, and I will try to keep this in mind forever in all of my speeches.
So this was I thought, a particularly nice example of somebody who was listening to her feedback and actually was very surprised by what she heard. So the next time that you're in a situation like this, where you're giving feedback to somebody, I challenge you to record it. Now, obviously, you have to ask whoever you're giving feedback to, you have to ask their permission. Don't do it secretly. That would be very awful. But I think that just recording something on your phone, audio recording with your voice record's very easy on a phone. Do it. Just tell them that it's for your own reflection, and I'm sure they won't mind. If they do, then ask somebody else when you do it with somebody else. But record it and listen back to it. And not only listen back to it, actually I'd also suggest a really nice tool I came across very recently, which is this Otter AI, where you can transcribe it. You can upload an audio file and it will transcribe it for you. Now, it's not perfect, but it's very good. And the audio files that I'm using, the audio quality isn't that great, and most people are second language English speakers. So it's not perfect, but it is good, and it takes the grunt work out of transcribing, which otherwise is hard work. So it's free you get a free trial, so you could certainly do it for free for 1 or 2 sessions. And I'd say have a go at listening back to yourself and reading back what you say, looking at how much you speak, looking at the questions you ask, looking at the kind of way you express the difficult things, how kind you are. So I hope that that's been of a bit of interest, and I really encourage you to do that recording thing, because I know people don't like to do it because they feel embarrassed about it, but it will really be a useful thing, I think, and that's my experience of it. It's very enlightening, surprising, and useful, and maybe it will make your interactions with the people that you give feedback to a little bit more humane. Thank you very much. I don't know if anybody's got any questions. I think I've just got a couple of minutes left for questions, if anybody has anything.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jo. That was a great, super interesting and useful presentation. We do have some questions. There are a couple of questions in reference to the display versus referential questions. The first is, doesn't it depend on the age level of the students we have? And then maybe use display questions first and then referential question as a follow-up?
So I think, in terms of the age level, I don't think it is about the age. I think it's about adjusting your questions to that person, however, whatever age and whatever level that person is. So it's also important to see how even younger learners feel, I think, as well as what they know. And in terms of answer, but I'll say obviously the kind of balance between those things might be different for different people. The same thing with asking, display and then referential questions. I think absolutely. I mean, I hope that what I gave you the idea of is that I don't think that one's bad and one's good. I don't want you to go away thinking display questions are bad, because that's often sort of the impression that's given, and I don't think that's true. I think they can be very, very useful. We do want to direct things sometimes, and that can be very helpful. but it's about how you use them and how you combine them. And so yes, definitely, I think a combination of both. And it may be a referential question, more general question, followed up with display questions, or the other way around, display question to close down the conversation a bit, and then what do you see within that? So yeah.
Great, and we have one more, we have about another minute. We have another question, and this was regarding the word but. The question is, so how do we connect the two ideas on either side of the but?
I think you just don't. Yes, I mean, sometimes it feels really odd because grammatically, of course, that contrastive conjunction is there, isn't it? But, or however, or whatever. But actually just two clauses. That's the easy linguistic way to do it. This was good. This is what you need to work on. Just literally separating the two clauses into two sentences. And sometimes it does feel odd. It feels like that just doesn't sound very grammatical. But I think that perhaps, as I said, maybe giving the first one, actually giving praise where it's due and not using it just as a sop to the but, to the critical things that are coming, perhaps.
Thank you very, very much to you, Joe Gakanga, our wonderful plenary session, and so interactive and fruitful, and we just thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you, and thank everybody for all your incredible I was a bit worried about how this was going to go for an hour when we couldn't have any kind of breakout rooms or anything, and it's been a real joy. Everybody's been so forthcoming, so thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to the next ones. Bye.
Thank you.